The Dialectic of Sex. The Case for Feminist Revolution. 1970. By Shulamith Firestone. Chapter 9. Dialectics of Cultural History. So far we have treated culture as synonymous with arts and letters, or at its broadest, humanities. This is a common enough confusion. But it is startling in this context. For we discover that, while only indirectly related to art, women have been entirely excluded from an equally important half of culture, science. If at least with the arts we could find enough material about the relationship of women to culture, whether indirectly as influence, stimulus, or subject matter, or even occasionally as direct participants, to fill at least a chapter, we can hardly find a relationship of women to science worthy of discussion. Perhaps in the broadest sense our statement that women are the emotional force behind all male culture holds true, but we are stretching the case to include modern science, where the empirical method specifically demands the exclusion of the scientist's personality from his research. Satisfaction of his emotional needs through a woman in his off hours may make him more stable, and thus steadier on the job, but this is far-fetched. But if even the indirect relationship of women to science is debatable, that there is no direct one is certainly not. One would have to search to find even one woman who had contributed in a major way to scientific culture. Moreover, the situation of women in science is not improving. Even with the work of discovery shifted from the great comprehensive minds of the past to small pragmatic university research teams, there are remarkably few women scientists. This absence of women at all levels of the scientific disciplines is so commonplace as to lead many, otherwise intelligent, people to attribute it to some deficiency, logic, in women themselves, or to women's own predilections for the emotional and subjective over the practical and rational. But the question cannot be so easily dismissed. It is true that women in science are in foreign territory, but how has this situation evolved? Why are there disciplines or branches of inquiry that demand only a male mind? Why would a woman, to qualify, have to develop an alien psychology? When and why was the female excluded from this type mind? How and why has science come to be defined as, and restricted to, the objective? I submit that not only were the arts and humanities corrupted by the sex duality, but that modern science has been determined by it. And moreover that culture reflects this polarity in its very organization. P. Snow was the first to note what had been becoming increasingly obvious, a deep fissure of culture. The liberal arts and the sciences had become incomprehensible to each other. Again, though the universal man of the Renaissance is widely lamented, specialization only increases. These are some of the modern symptoms of a long cultural disease based on the sex dualism. Let us examine the history of culture according to this hypothesis, that there is an underlying dialectic of sex. Section 1. The two modes of cultural history. For our analysis we shall define culture in the following way. Culture is the attempt by man to realize the conceivable in the possible. Man's consciousness of himself within his environment distinguishes him from the lower animals, and turns him into the only animal capable of culture. This consciousness, his highest faculty, allows him to project mentally states of being that do not exist at the moment. Able to construct a past and future, he becomes a creature of time, a historian and a prophet. More than this, he can imagine objects and states of being that have never existed and may never exist in the real world. He becomes a maker of art. Thus, for example, though the ancient Greeks did not know how to fly, still they could imagine it. The myth of Icarus was the formulation in fantasy of their conception of the state flying. But man was not only able to project the conceivable into fantasy. He also learned to impose it on reality, by accumulating knowledge, learning experience, about that reality and how to handle it. He could shape it to his liking. This accumulation of skills for controlling the environment, technology, is another means to reaching the same end, the realization of the conceivable in the possible. Thus, in our example, if, in the BC era, man could fly on the magic carpet of myth or fantasy, by the 20th century, his technology, the accumulation of his practical skills, had made it possible for him to fly in actuality. He had invented the aeroplane. Another example, in the biblical legend, The Jews, an agricultural people stranded for 40 years in the desert, were provided by God with manna, a miraculous substance that could be transformed at will into food of any color, texture, or taste. Modern food processing, especially with the Green Revolution, will probably soon create a totally artificial food production, perhaps with this chameleon attribute. Again, in ancient legend, man could imagine mixed species, for example, the centaur or the unicorn, or hybrid births, like the birth of an animal from a human, or a virgin birth. The current biological revolution, with its increasing knowledge of the reproductive process, could now, if only the first crude stages, create these monstrosities in reality. Brownies and elves, the golem of medieval Jewish lore, Mary Shelley's monster in Frankenstein, were the imaginative constructions that proceeded by several centuries the corresponding technological acumen. Many other fantastical constructions, ghosts, mental telepathy, Methuselah's age, remain to be realized by modern science. These two different responses, the idealistic and the scientific, do not merely exist simultaneously, there is a dialogue between the two. The imaginative construction precedes the technological, though often it does not develop until the technological know-how is in the air. For example, the art of science fiction developed, in the main, only a half-century in advance of, and now coexists with, the scientific revolution that is transforming it into a reality, for example, an innocuous one, the moon flight. The phrases way out, far out, spaced, the observation it's like something out of science fiction are common language. In the aesthetic response, because it always develops in advance, and is thus the product of another age, the same realization may take on a sensational or unrealistic cast, for example, Frankenstein's monster, as opposed to, let us say, General Electric's CAM, cybernetic anthropomorphic machines, handyman. An artist can never know in advance just how his vision might be articulated in reality. Culture then is the sum of, and the dynamic between, the two modes through which the mind attempts to transcend the limitations and contingencies of reality. These two types of cultural responses entail different methods to achieve the same end, the realization of the conceivable in the possible. In the first, the individual denies the limitations of the given reality by escaping from it altogether, to define, create, his own possible. In the provinces of the imagination, objectified in some way, whether through the development of a visual image within some artificial boundary, say 4 square feet of canvas, through visual images projected through verbal symbols, poetry, with sound ordered into a sequence, music, or with verbal ideas ordered into a progression, theology, philosophy, he creates an ideal world governed by his own artificially imposed order and harmony, a structure in which he consciously relates each part to the whole, a static, and therefore timeless, construction. The degree to which he abstracts his creation from reality is unimportant, for even when he most appears to imitate, he has created an illusion governed by its own, perhaps hidden, set of artificial laws. Degas said that the artist had to lie in order to tell the truth. This search for the ideal, realized by means of an artificial medium, we shall call the aesthetic mode. In the second type of cultural response, the contingencies of reality are overcome, not through the creation of an alternate reality, but through the mastery of reality's own workings. The laws of nature are exposed, then turned against it, to shape it in accordance with man's conception. If there is a poison, man assumes there is an antidote. If there is a disease, he searches for the cure. Every fact of nature that is understood can be used to alter it. But to achieve the ideal through such a procedure takes much longer, and is infinitely more painful, especially in the early stages of knowledge. For the vast and intricate machine of nature must be entirely understood, and there are always fresh and unexpected layers of complexity, before it can be thoroughly controlled. Thus, before any solution can be found to the deepest contingencies of the human condition, for example, death, natural processes of growth and decay must be catalogued, smaller laws related to larger ones. This scientific method, also attempted by Marx and Engels in their materialist approach to history, is the attempt by man to master nature through the complete understanding of its mechanics. The coaxing of reality to conform with man's conceptual ideal, through the application of information extrapolated from itself, we shall call the technological mode. We have defined culture as the sum of, and the dialectic between, the two different modes through which man can resolve the tension created by the flexibility of his mental faculties within the limitations of his given environment. The correspondence of these two different cultural modes with the two sexes respectively is unmistakable. We have noted how those few women directly creating culture have gravitated to disciplines within the aesthetic mode. There is a good reason for this. The aesthetic response corresponds with female behavior. The same terminology can be applied to either subjective, intuitive, introverted, wishful, dreamy or fantastic, concerned with the subconscious, the ID, emotional, even temperamental, hysterical. Correspondingly, the technological response is the masculine response, objective, logical, extroverted, realistic, concerned with the conscious mind, the ego, rational, mechanical, pragmatic and down-to-earth, stable. Thus the aesthetic is the cultural recreation of that half of the psychological spectrum that has been assigned to the female, whereas the technological response is the cultural magnification of the male half. Just as we have assumed the biological division of the sexes for procreation to be the fundamental natural duality from which grows all further division into classes, so we now assume the sex division to be the root of this basic cultural division as well. The interplay between these two cultural responses, the male technological mode and the female aesthetic mode, recreates at yet another level the dialectic of the sexes, as well as its superstructure, the caste, and the economic class dialectic. And just as the merging of the divided sexual, racial, and economic classes is a precondition for sexual, racial, or economic revolution respectively, so the merging of the aesthetic with the technological culture is the precondition of a cultural revolution. And just as the revolutionary goal of the sexual, racial, and economic revolutions is, rather than a mere leveling of imbalances, of class, an elimination of class categories altogether, so the end result of a cultural revolution must be, not merely the integration of the two streams of culture, but the elimination of cultural categories altogether, the end of culture itself as we know it. But before we discuss this ultimate cultural revolution or even the state of cultural division in our own time, let us see how this third level of the sex dialectic, the interaction between the technological and aesthetic modes, operated to determine the flow of cultural history. At first technological knowledge accumulated slowly. Gradually man learned to control the crudest aspects of his environment. He discovered the tool, control of fire, the wheel, the melting of ore to make weapons and plows, even, eventually, the alphabet, but these discoveries were few and far between, because as yet he had no systematic way of initiating them. Eventually however, he had gathered enough practical knowledge to build whole systems, for example, medicine or architecture, to create juridical, political, social, and economic institutions. Civilization developed from the primitive hunting horde into an agricultural society, and finally, through progressive stages, into feudalism, capitalism, and the first attempts at socialism. But in all this time, man's ability to picture an ideal world was far ahead of his ability to create one. The primary cultural forms of ancient civilizations, religion and its offshoots, mythology, legend, primitive art and magic, prophecy and history, were in the aesthetic mode. They imposed only an artificial, imaginary order on a universe still mysterious and chaotic. Even primitive scientific theories were only poetic metaphors for what would later be realized empirically. The science and philosophy and mathematics of classical antiquity, forerunners of modern science, by sheer imaginative prowess, operating in a vacuum independently of material laws, anticipated much of what was later proven. Democritus' atoms and Lucretius' substance foreshadowed by thousands of years the discoveries of modern science. But they were realized only within the realm of the imaginary aesthetic mode. In the Middle Ages the Judeo-Christian heritage was assimilated with pagan culture, to produce medieval religious art and the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas and the scholastics. Though concurrently Arab science, an outgrowth of the Greek Alexandrian period, 3rd century BC to 7th century AD, was amassing considerable information in such areas as geography, astronomy, physiology, mathematics, a tabulation essential to the later empiricism, there was little dialogue. Western science, with its alchemy, its astrology, the humors of medieval medicine, was still in a pseudo-scientific stage, or, in our definition, still operating according to the aesthetic mode. This medieval aesthetic culture, composed of the classical and Christian legacies, culminated in the humanism of the Renaissance. Until the Renaissance, then, culture occurred in the aesthetic mode because, prior to that time, technology had been so primitive, the body of scientific knowledge so far from complete. In terms of the sex dialectic, This long stage of cultural history corresponds with the matriarchal stage of civilization. The female principle, dark, mysterious, uncontrollable, reigned, elevated by man himself, still in awe of unfathomable nature. Men of culture were its high priests of homage, until and through the Renaissance all men of culture were practitioners of the ideal aesthetic mode, thus, in a sense, artists. The Renaissance, the pinnacle of cultural humanism, was the golden age of the aesthetic, female, mode. And also the beginning of its end. By the 16th century culture was undergoing a change as profound as the shift from matriarchy to patriarchy in terms of the sex dialectic, and corresponding to the decline of feudalism in the class dialectic. This was the first merging of the aesthetic culture with the technological, in the creation of modern, empirical, science. In the Renaissance, Aristotelian scholasticism had remained powerful though the first cracks in the dam were already apparent. But it was not until Francis Bacon, who first proposed to use science to extend more widely the limits of the power and the greatnesses of man, that the marriage of the modes was consummated. Bacon and Locke transformed philosophy, the attempt to understand life, from abstract speculation detached from the real world, metaphysics, ethics, theology, aesthetics, logic, to an uncovering of the real laws of nature, through proof and demonstration, empirical science. In the empirical method propounded by Francis Bacon, insight and imagination had to be used only at the earliest stage of the inquiry. Tentative hypotheses would be formed by induction from the facts, and then consequences would be deduced logically and tested for consistency among themselves and for agreement with the primary facts and results of ad hoc experiments. The hypothesis would become an accepted theory only after all tests had been passed, and would remain, at least until proven wrong, a theory capable of predicting phenomena to a high degree of probability. The empirical view held that by recording and tabulating all possible observations and experiments in this manner, the natural order would emerge automatically. Though at first the question why was still asked as often as the question how, after information began to accumulate, each discovery building upon the last to complete the jigsaw, the speculative, the intuitive, and the imaginative gradually became less valuable. When once the initial foundations had been laid by men of the stature of Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, thinkers still in the inspired aesthetic science tradition, hundreds of anonymous technicians could move to fill in the blanks, leading to, in our own time, the dawn of a golden age of science, to the technological mode what the Renaissance had been to the aesthetic mode. Section 2. The two cultures today. Now, in 1970, we are experiencing a major scientific breakthrough. The new physics, relativity, and the astrophysical theories of contemporary science had already been realized by the first part of this century. Now, in the latter part, we are arriving, with the help of the electron microscope and other new tools, at similar achievements in biology, biochemistry, and all the life sciences. Important discoveries are made yearly by small, scattered work teams all over the United States, and in other countries as well, of the magnitude of DNA and genetics, or of Ian Miller's work in the early 50s on the origins of life. Full mastery of the reproductive process is in sight, and there has been significant advance in understanding the basic life and death process. The nature of aging and growth, sleep and hibernation, the chemical functioning of the brain and the development of consciousness and memory are all beginning to be understood in their entirety. This acceleration promises to continue for another century, or however long it takes to achieve the goal of empiricism, total understanding of the laws of nature. This amazing accumulation of concrete knowledge in only a few hundred years is the product of philosophy's switch from the aesthetic to the technological mode. The combination of pure science, science in the aesthetic mode, with pure technology, caused greater progress towards the goal of technology, the realization of the conceivable in the actual, than had been made in thousands of years of previous history. Empiricism itself is only the means, a quicker and more effective technique, for achieving technology's ultimate cultural goal, the building of the ideal in the real world. One of its own basic dictates is that a certain amount of material must be collected and arranged into categories before any decisive comparison, analysis, or discovery can be made. In this light, centuries of empirical science have been little more than the building of foundations for the breakthroughs of our own time and the future. The amassing of information and understanding of the laws and mechanical processes of nature, Pure research is but a means to a larger end, total understanding of nature in order, ultimately, to achieve transcendence. In his view of the development and goals of cultural history, Engels's final goal, quoted above in the context of political revolution, is again worthy of quotation: the whole sphere of the conditions of life which environ man, and have hitherto ruled him, now comes under the dominion and control of man, who for the first time becomes the real conscious lord of nature. Empirical science is to culture what the shift to patriarchy was to the sex dialectic, and what the bourgeois period is to the Marxian dialectic, a latter-day stage prior to revolution. Moreover, the three dialectics are integrally related to one another vertically as well as horizontally, the empirical science growing out of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeois period is in itself a stage of the patriarchal period, follows the humanism of the aristocracy, the female principle, the matriarchy, and with its development of the empirical method in order to amass real knowledge, development of modern industry in order to amass capital, eventually puts itself out of business. The body of scientific discovery, the new productive modes, must finally outgrow the empirical, capitalistic, mode of using them. And just as the internal contradictions of capitalism must become increasingly apparent, so must the internal contradictions of empirical science, as in the development of pure knowledge to the point where it assumes a life of its own, for example, the atomic bomb. As long as man is still engaged only in the means, the charting of the ways of nature, the gathering of pure knowledge, to his final realization, mastery of nature, his knowledge, because it is not complete, is dangerous. So dangerous that many scientists are wondering whether they shouldn't put a lid on certain types of research. But this solution is hopelessly inadequate. The machine of empiricism has its own momentum, and is, for such purposes, completely out of control. Could one actually decide what to discover or not discover? That is, by definition, antithetical to the whole empirical process that Bacon set in motion. Many of the most important discoveries have been practically laboratory accidents, with social implications barely realized by the scientists who stumbled into them. For example, as recently as 5 years ago, Professor F.C. Stewart of Cornell discovered a process called cloning. By placing a single carrot cell in a rotating nutrient, he was able to grow a whole sheet of identical carrot cells, from which he eventually recreated the same carrot. The understanding of a similar process for more developed animal cells, were it to slip out, as did experiments with mind-expanding drugs, could have some awesome implications. Or, again, imagine parthenogenesis, virgin birth, as practiced by the greenfly, actually applied to human fertility. Another internal contradiction in empirical science, the mechanistic, deterministic, soulless scientific worldview, which is the result of the means to, rather than the, inherently noble and often forgotten, ultimate purpose of, empiricism, the actualization of the ideal in reality. The cost in humanity is particularly high to the scientist himself, who becomes little more than a cultural technician. For, ironically enough, to properly accumulate knowledge of the universe requires a mentality the very opposite of comprehensive and integrated. Though in the long run the efforts of the individual scientist could lead to domination of the environment in the interest of humanity, temporarily the empirical method demands that its practitioners themselves become objective, mechanistic, over-precise. The public image of the white-coated Dr. Jekyll with no feelings for his subjects, mere guinea pigs, is not entirely false. There is no room for feelings in the scientist's work. He is forced to eliminate or isolate them in what amounts to an occupational hazard. At best he can resolve this problem by separating his professional from his personal self, by compartmentalizing his emotion. Thus, though often well versed in an academic way about the arts, the frequency of this, at any rate, is higher than of artists who are well versed in science. The scientist is generally out of touch with his direct emotions and senses, or, at best, he is emotionally divided. His private and public life are out of whack, and because his personality is not well integrated, he can be surprisingly conventional. Dear, I discovered how to clone people at the lab today. Now we can go skiing at Aspen. He feels no contradiction in living by convention, even in attending church, for he has never integrated the amazing material of modern science with his daily life. Often it takes the misuse of his discovery to alert him to that connection which he has long since lost in his own mind. The catalogue of scientific vices is familiar, it duplicates, exaggerates, the catalogue of male vices in general. This is to be expected. If the technological mode develops from the male principle, then it follows that its practitioners would develop the warpings of the male personality in the extreme. But let us leave science for the moment, winding up for the ultimate cultural revolution, to see what meanwhile had been happening to the aesthetic culture proper. With philosophy in the broadest classical sense, including pure science, defecting, aesthetic culture became increasingly narrow and ingrown, reduced to the arts and humanities in the refined sense that we now know them. Art, hereafter referring to the liberal arts, especially arts and letters, had always been, in its very definition, a search for the ideal, removed from the real world. But in primitive days it had been the handmaiden of religion, articulating the common dream, objectifying other worlds of the common fantasy, for example, the art of the Egyptian tombs, to explain and excuse this one. Thus, even though it was removed from the real world, it served an important social function. It satisfied artificially those wishes of society that couldn't yet be realized in reality. Though it was patronized and supported only by the aristocracy, the cultured elite, it was never as detached from life as it later became, for the society of those times was, for all practical purposes, synonymous with its ruling class, whether priesthood, monarchy, or nobility. The masses were never considered by society to be a legitimate part of humanity. They were slaves, nothing more than human animals, drones, or serfs, without whose labor the small cultured elite could not have maintained itself. The gradual squeezing out of the aristocracy by the new middle class, the bourgeoisie, signaled the erosion of aesthetic culture. We have seen that capitalism intensified the worst attributes of patriarchalism, how, for example, the nuclear family emerged from the large, loose family household of the past, to reinforce the weakening sex-class system, oppressing women and children more intimately than ever before. The cultural mode favored by this new, heavily patriarchal bourgeoisie was the male technological mode, objective, realistic, factual, common sense rather than the effeminate, otherworldly, romantic idealist aesthetic mode. The bourgeoisie, searching for the ideal in the real, soon developed the empirical science that we have described. To the extent that they had any remaining use for aesthetic culture, it was only for realistic art, as opposed to the idealistic art of classical antiquity, or the abstract religious art of primitive or medieval times. For a time they went in for a literature that described reality, best exemplified by the 19th century novel, and a decorative easel art, still lifes, portraits, family scenes, interiors. Public museums and libraries were built alongside the old salons and private galleries. But with its entrenchment as a secure, even primary, class, the bourgeoisie no longer needed to imitate aristocratic cultivation. More important, with the rapid development of their new science and technology, the little practical value they had for art was eclipsed. Take the scientific development of the camera. The bourgeoisie soon had little need for portrait painters. The little that painters or novelists had been able to do for them, the camera could do better. Modern art was a desperate, but finally self-defeating, retaliation, abattre le bourgeois, for these injuries, the evaporation of its social function, the severance of the social umbilical cord, the dwindling of the old sources of patronage. The modern art tradition, associated primarily with Picasso and Cézanne, and including all the major schools of the 20th century, Cubism, Constructivism, Futurism, Expressionism, Surrealism, Abstract Expressionism, and so on, is not an authentic expression of modernity as much as it is a reaction to the realism of the bourgeoisie. Post-Impressionism deliberately renounced all reality-affirming conventions. Indeed, the process began with Impressionism itself, which broke down the illusion into its formal values, swallowing reality whole and spitting it up again as art, to lead eventually to an art for art's sake so pure, a negation of reality so complete as to make it ultimately meaningless, sterile, even absurd. Cab drivers are Philistine, they know a put-on when they see one. The deliberate violating, deforming, fracturing of the image, called modern art, was nothing more than a 50-year idol smashing, eventually leading to our present cultural impasse. In the 20th century, its lifeblood drained, its social function nullified altogether, art is thrown back on whatever wealthy classes remain, those nouveau riches, particularly in America, still suffering from a cultural inferiority complex, who still need to prove they have arrived by evidencing a taste for culture. The sequestering of intellectuals in ivory tower universities, where, except for the sciences, they have little effect on the outside world, no matter how brilliant, and they aren't, because they no longer have the necessary feedback, the abstruse, often literally unintelligible, jargon of the social sciences, the cliquish literary quarterlies with their esoteric poetry, the posh 57th Street galleries and museums. It is no accident that they are right next door to Saks Fifth Avenue and Bonnevitte Teller, staffed and supplied by, for the most part, fawning rich widows' hairdresser types, and not least the vulturous critical establishment thriving on the remains of what was once a great and vital culture. All testify to the death of aesthetic humanism. For in the centuries that science climbed to new heights, art decayed. Its forced inbreeding transformed it into a secret code. By definition escapist from reality, it now turned in upon itself to such degree that it gnawed away its own vitals. It became diseased, neurotically self-pitying, self-conscious, focused on the past, as opposed to the futurist orientation of the technological culture, and thus frozen into conventions and academies, orthodoxies of which avant-garde is only the latest. Pining for remembered glories, the grand old days when beauty was in flower, it became pessimistic and nihilistic, increasingly hostile to the society at large, the Philistines. And when the cocky young science attempted to woo art from its ivory tower, eventually Garrett, with false promises of the courting lover, "You can come down now," were making the world a better place every day, art refused more vehemently than ever to deal with him, much less accept his corrupt gifts, retreating ever deeper into her daydreams. Neoclassicism, Romanticism, Expressionism, Surrealism, Existentialism. The individual artist or intellectual saw himself as either a member of an invisible elite, a highbrow, or as a down-and-outer, mingling with whoever was deemed the dregs of his society. In both cases, whether playing aristocrat or bohemian, he was on the margins of the society as a whole. The artist had become a freak. His increasing alienation from the world around him, the new world that science had created was, especially in its primitive stages, an incredible horror, only intensifying his need to escape to the ideal world of art. His lack of an audience led to a mystique of genius. Like an ascetic Saint Simeon on his pedestal, the genius in the garret was expected to create masterpieces in a vacuum. But his artery to the outside world had been severed. His task, increasingly impossible, often forced him literally into madness, or suicide. Painted into a corner with nowhere else to go, the artist has got to begin to come to terms with the modern world. He is not too good at it, like an invalid shut away too long, he doesn't know anything about the world anymore, neither politics, nor science, nor even how to live or love. Until now, yes, even now, though less and less so, sublimation, that warping of personality, was commendable. It was the only, albeit indirect, way to achieve fulfillment. But the artistic process has, almost, outlived its usefulness. And its price is high. The first attempts to confront the modern world have been for the most part misguided. The Bauhaus, a famous example, failed at its objective of replacing an irrelevant easel art. Only a few optical illusions and designy chairs marked the grave, ending up with a hybrid, neither art nor science, and certainly not the sum of the two. They failed because they didn't understand science on its own terms. To them, seeing in the old aesthetic way, it was simply a rich new subject matter to be digested whole into the traditional aesthetic system. It is as if one were to see a computer as only a beautifully ordered set of lights and sounds, missing completely the function itself. The scientific experiment is not only beautiful, an elegant structure, another piece of an abstract puzzle, something to be used in the next collage, but scientists, too, in their own way, see science as this abstraction divorced from life. It has a real intrinsic meaning of its own, similar to, but not the same as, the presence, the en soi, of modern painting. Many artists have made the mistake of thus trying to annex science, to incorporate it into their own artistic framework, rather than using it to expand that framework. Is the current state of aesthetic culture all bleak? No, there have been some progressive developments in contemporary art. We have mentioned how the realistic tradition in painting died with the camera. This tradition had developed over centuries to a level of illusionism with the brush, examine a Bugo, that was the equal of, better than, the early photography, then considered only another graphic medium, like etching. The beginning of the new art of film and the realistic tradition of painting overlapped, peaked, in artists like Degas, who used a camera in his work. Then realistic art took a new course, either it became decadent, academic, divorced from any market and meaning, for example, the nudes that linger on in art classes and second-rate galleries, or it was fractured into the expressionist or surrealist image, posing an alternate internal or fantastical reality. Meanwhile, however, the young art of film, based on a true synthesis of the aesthetic and technological modes, as empiricism itself had been, carried on the vital realistic tradition. And just as with the marriage of the divided male and female principles, empirical science bore fruit, so did the medium of film. But, unlike other aesthetic media of the past, it broke down the very division between the artificial and the real, between culture and life itself, on which the aesthetic mode is based. Other related developments, the exploration of artificial materials, for example, plastics, the attempt to confront plastic culture itself, pop art, the breakdown of traditional categories of media, mixed media, and of the distinctions between art and reality itself, happenings, environments. But I find it difficult unreservedly to call these latter developments progressive, as yet they have produced largely puerile and meaningless works. The artist does not yet know what reality is, let alone how to affect it. Paper cups lined up on the street, pieces of paper thrown into an empty lot, no matter how many ponderous reviews they get in art news, are a waste of time. If these clumsy attempts are at all hopeful, it is only insofar as they are signs of the breakdown of fine art. The merging of the aesthetic with the technological mode will gradually suffocate pure high art altogether. The first breakdown of categories, the re-merging of art with a technologized reality, indicates that we are now in the transitional pre-revolutionary period, in which the three separate cultural streams, technology, applied science, pure research, and pure modern art, will melt together, along with the rigid sex categories they reflect. The sex-based polarity of culture still causes many casualties. If even the pure scientist, for example, nuclear physicist, let alone the applied scientist, for example, engineer, suffers from too much male, becoming authoritarian, conventional, emotionally insensitive, narrowly unable to understand his own work within the scientific, let alone cultural or social, jigsaw, the artist, in terms of the sex division, has embodied all the imbalances and suffering of the female personality, temperamental, insecure, paranoid, defeatist, narrow. And the recent withholding of reinforcements from behind the front, the larger society, has exaggerated all this enormously. His overdeveloped ID has nothing left to balance it. Where the pure scientist is schiz, or worse, ignorant of emotional reality altogether, the pure artist rejects reality because of its lack of perfection, and, in modern centuries, for its ugliness. And who suffers the most, the blind scientist, or the lame artist? Culturally, we have had only the choice between one sex role or the other, either a social marginality leading to self-consciousness, introversion, defeatism, pessimism, oversensitivity, and lack of touch with reality, or a split professionalized personality, emotional ignorance, the narrow views of the specialist. The Anti-Culture Revolution. I have tried to show how the history of culture mirrors the sex dichotomy in its very organization and development. Culture develops not only out of the underlying economic dialectic, but also out of the deeper sex dialectic. Thus, there is not only a horizontal dynamic, but a vertical one as well. Each of these three strata forms one more story of the dialectics of history based on the biological dualism. At present we have reached the final stages of patriarchy, capitalism, corporate capitalism, and of the two cultures at once. We shall soon have a triplicate set of preconditions for evolution, the absence of which is responsible for the failure of revolutions of the past. The difference between what is almost possible and what exists is generating revolutionary forces. We are nearing, I believe we shall have, perhaps within a century, if the snowball of empirical knowledge doesn't smash first of its own velocity, a cultural revolution, as well as a sexual and economic one. The cultural revolution, like the economic revolution, must be predicated on the elimination of the sex dualism at the origins not only of class, but also of cultural division. What might this cultural revolution look like? Unlike cultural revolutions of the past, it would not be merely a quantitative escalation, more and better culture, in the sense that the Renaissance was a high point of the aesthetic mode, or that the present technological breakthrough is the accumulation of centuries of practical knowledge about the real world. Great as they were, Neither the aesthetic nor the technological culture, even at their respective peaks, ever achieved universality. Either it was holistic but divorced from the real world, or it achieved progress, at the price of cultural schizophrenia, and the falseness and dryness of objectivity. What we shall have in the next cultural revolution is the reintegration of the male, technological mode, with the female, aesthetic mode, to create an androgynous culture surpassing the highs of either cultural stream, or even of the sum of their integrations. More than a marriage, rather an abolition of the cultural categories themselves, a mutual cancellation, a matter-antimatter explosion, ending with a poof. Culture itself. We shall not miss it. We shall no longer need it. By then humanity will have mastered nature totally, will have realized in actuality its streams. With the full achievement of the conceivable in the actual, the surrogate of culture will no longer be necessary. The sublimation process, a detour to wish fulfillment, will give way to direct satisfaction in experience, as felt now only by children, or adults on drugs. Though normal adults play to varying degrees, the example that illustrates more immediately to almost everyone the intense level of this future experience, ranking 0 on a scale of accomplishment, nothing to show for it, but nevertheless somehow always worth everyone's while, is lovemaking. Control and delay of ID satisfaction by the ego will be unnecessary, the ID can live free. Enjoyment will spring directly from being and acting itself, the process of experience, rather than from the quality of achievement. When the male technological mode can at last produce in actuality what the female aesthetic mode had envisioned, we shall have eliminated the need for either.